Hello and welcome to this video by Inspire Cows. My name's Mike Steele and this is the channel dedicated to dairy health. Today we're going to be talking about heat stress in cows, how to cool them and how to keep them comfortable when the heat goes on. So firstly, we're going to talk about the definitions of heat stress. So what is heat and what is stress? Then we're going to be talking about the consequences of heat stress and what happens on your dairy if you have this occurring. And thirdly, we're going to be talking about capturing the value if you do something about it, and a few tips on what to do and how to do them. When we're talking about heat stress, we need to be aware that cows are really no different to humans. They're mammals and we all like to stay within our comfortable limits. So there are times when we feel really hot and there's times when we feel kind of comfortable. Now cows are different to humans in that they have an internal heating boiler called a rumen, and this is going to really try and ramp up that heat. So they're comfortable at much lower temperatures than humans are. So in a region of 4 degrees C to 12 degrees C is around about comfortable for a cow. But when they start to get above a certain threshold, then they're going to start to feel the heat, and those effects will come out in your dairy. Now a lot of things I hear when I'm traveling around the world and dealing with dairies is, oh well, you know, I'm too far north for heat stress. I'm in the UK, or I'm in Denmark, I'm in northern Germany, and heat stress just doesn't happen here. But that's not true, because I've actually visited farms in Estonia, which is not far from Finland, which is way up north, and they experienced heat stress there over a period of 2 months. It rarely gets above 24 degrees centigrade for very long, but for 2 months one dairy showed a loss of over 150,000 euros because they lost 2.5 litres of milk over a 2-month period. With 2,500 cows, you can't ignore that, and that's that far north. So I guarantee you probably will see heat stress effects at some point in the year wherever you are. Well, the first thing to understand about heat when we define it is it's not just about heat. So there are temperatures, but there are also humidity, and this is the amount of water that is saturated in the air. Now we can test this, and there are YouTube videos. If you look up a relative humidity sling psychrometer, then you can find videos on how to do this. But really what they're doing is they're testing the temperature on a dry bulb of a thermometer against a wet bulb of a thermometer, and they're looking at the differences of those two. So the kind of thing I'm talking about here is if you had a dry bulb thermometer and you took a temperature of the room and then you switched on a kettle and you took the temperature again with a wet bulb thermometer, you would see a difference. And that's because the relative humidity of the room increases. And we tend to feel hotter when it's more humid. And the reason for this is because it's more difficult to evaporate heat from our skin. And it's the same with cows. So this means that we need to take into consideration temperature and humidity. And there are ways to do that. There are tables that you can find again on the internet called temperature humidity index. And these will show humidity on one side and temperature on the other, and you can see where you are on that map. And they will also be graded for dairy cows, so you can have an area where it's low heat stress and has no effect on the cows. And then you have mild, moderate, severe, and then risk of death. It can actually get that bad. So when we look at the THI index, roughly a temperature humidity index of between 65 and 68 is the upper threshold for the comfort limits of a cow before you start to see performance effects. Performance effects like yield or reproduction effects. So we will see physiological effects on the cow. So these will be things like a rise in steroid hormones, so cortisol. We can take a blood sample from a cow and we can see steroid hormones go up whenever we see heat stress. We can also see the level of white cells in the blood, which are the immune cells and fight pathogens. Now they will rise, but other types will fall, and these are the ones that protect them against viruses or help to repair mechanisms. Those ones tend to decrease. We also have a decrease of white cells going to the udder, so there's less protection in the udder for mastitis. We can also see a decrease in prolactin receptor production. Now prolactin is the hormone in a cow that makes them make milk. So if there's less receptors to fit on, for that hormone to fit on, then there will be less milk being made by the cow. This is going to decrease the amount of milk that she's going to make. Now, as well as the external temperature rising, her internal temperature will rise too. So if you take a thermometer and you get a rectal temperature from them, that will tend to rise in heat stress, which is really no surprise. But their dry matter intake will also go down. And what we tend to find, and research has shown, is that dry matter intake decreases, but their yield decreases more than dry matter intake in extreme heat stress. So the yield drop only accounts for 50% of the dry matter intake drop. So the yield is dropping further because not only is there less prolactin able to fit on the receptors and make milk, but we also have less cells being made in the udder that can make milk. So there's lots of things that happen in heat stress that are really working against us on the dairy. Now, as well as yield effects, we can also see reproductive effects. So these are things that affect fertility. Now, when the heat rises, you get lower follicle growth, so not so many follicles actually tend to mature. There's a delay in the development of the follicle, and also luteolysis will decrease as well. So we see less cycling. And in extreme heat stress, it's actually well documented and well known when I travel to places like Pakistan or the Middle East, then they don't even try to get their cows pregnant in certain months of the year because they just know that they're not going to get pregnant. They don't show the signs of pregnancy because there's no follicles there because it's so hot. So are there any tools that you can use on the farm to help you detect that heat stress is actually there? And the answer is yes, there's plenty. The first one is just your eyes to walk around and see what the cows are doing and look at their behaviour. But there are other things too. Now there is some fairly cheap things on the internet. You can get an anemometer here, which is a wind meter, and when the wind blows, the fan will go round and it will tell you maximum and minimum wind speed. It can also tell you the temperature, and some of the more expensive ones can tell you the temperature, humidity, and work out the temperature humidity index for you. So these are quite useful to do, but be aware you use them where the cows are going. So don't put them in the aisle where you're standing, and also don't measure wind speed way above the cow or in the middle of the barn. Go down to cow level and where they're sitting in the barn. So down at the level of the cubicle or stall, go down to their head height and measure wind speed there. Now what about mechanisms of heat dissipation? So there are three ways that heat dissipates, and this is convection, conduction and radiation. Now convection is what we use normally in building design. So when we're building a barn, we need to make sure that it's not only high enough for the heat to rise from the cow, they will drive this heat themselves. So the heat rises in the barn, but then if there's nowhere for it to go, as in the roof is closed at the top, then the heat will just circulate within the barn. So we need some kind of gap at the top to let that heat out and to drive the heat upwards. And this will also drive airflow through the barn too, because if heat is rising upwards and out through the ridge, then air is coming in through the sides or the ends of the barn. So this will also drive heat and airflow. Now there are minimum heights to a barn and minimum gradients of the roof as well. So when you're building a barn, then for a 29 metre barn you need at least 4.2 metres high. And you're also talking on any roof it should be over a 4 to 6% gradient. The ridge gap is 5 centimetres for every 3 metre width of the barn. And if you want to put a cap on that there as well, like in the UK where we see lots of rain, then you might want to put a cap on there. And if you're putting a cap, then you need to make that at least a half of the height of the width of the ridge. So that addresses convection. Now radiation. Now radiation is how we radiate heat, and heat radiation comes from the animals themselves, and it can come from the sun too. Now radiation from the sun we can do something about, and when we're designing roofs or even sides of barns, then insulation is a great thing to consider. So insulation will stop the heat coming down to the roof of the barn and then radiating down onto the cows. Now the third heat dissipation method is conduction. And this one's really important. This is something that we can do something about. As well as convection with airflow, so we can help it through with fans, we'll talk about that in a minute, but conduction is really important. Now, if I'm feeling hot and I increase airflow over my face, then I feel cooler. But if I take some water and I put some of that against my cheek, I feel cooler already without any airflow. But if I put airflow over that, I cool down a lot more. Now this is because water has a property called the latent heat of evaporation. And when water evaporates, it actively takes energy out of you in order to dissipate itself and evaporate itself and dissipate that heat. And that's why it feels so much cooler. So water is a really good way to cool cows down, and it can sometimes be more cost effective than the fans, so it may be the first thing you think about rather than the second when you're talking about heat abatement. We're going to consider here airflow, and we're going to consider airflow in the barn. I've already shown you the anemometer, and now I'm going to show you a quick video of what I saw in the barn. Now when we're talking about airflow, it's tempting to install fans into your dairy, and this is a really good thing to do. However, where you put those fans, their position, their angle, their frequency in the building, and the amount of fans you have is really important. And sometimes the marketing methods that are used with the fans when people come to sell you fans in the dairy aren't quite the right things. A lot of companies give some really brilliant advice, but I see some farmers really just expecting the fans to do things that they just cannot do. So I'm not going to tell you how many fans to put in your barn or where to put them exactly, because that depends on the power and the type of fan that you have. But generally, if you have a barn, then you want the fans to always give at least 3 to 5 kilometers per hour airflow at cow level. So when you're positioning fans, I usually go for over the stalls first, because that's where the cows spend the most time. And it's when they're going to be ruminating, and it's when they're going to be making a lot of energy from that food that you're feeding them. And you do need to feed them slightly more food in heat stress conditions, because it takes energy to dissipate that heat. So it requires more energy as well as the energy it's taking to lactate. So the higher the yield, the more you will need to feed them, as well as a little bit more in heat stress as well. So consult your local nutritionists for that kind of advice. So the first way to cool a cow down, and the easiest way, is to put her under shade. And when you're building a barn, then east-west facing is a brilliant idea, because that's giving you the maximum amount of shade throughout the day as the sun rises from east and down to the west. Provide plenty of water to drink. It needs to be clean, and it needs to have sufficient access. So when cows drink water, they need at least 10 centimeters linear access per cow. It's also good to think about sprinklers. Now, sprinklers are usually put along the feed face, usually above the head rails along the feed face, and the sprinklers need to be at least 30 centimeters above the top rail, because the cows are very curious and they can damage the nozzles if they can reach them. The next thing to consider is frequency of the nozzles. So you want one nozzle to cover roughly 3 cows, and you want them to cover the area from the neck to the top of the shoulders. There is no evidence to show that water sprinklers increase the risk of mastitis. Now, a lot of people talk about droplet size. Do we do misting or do we do visible droplets? The answer, and there was a great paper in Journal of Dairy Science in 2018 on this, the answer is most definitely droplets. Depending on whether you're in humid conditions or dry conditions, droplets are the answer. Misting is quite frequently, in my experience of walking around dairies anyway, quite frequently if you have fan systems and you have misting systems, then the fans just blow the mist out the barn. They tend to feel cool when you walk into the barn, so the humans are okay, but as far as the cow goes, if you go to cow level, makes no difference to the temperature humidity index there. So what cows do need to do is to be soaked with water, and then for the water to be turned off, or they go and lay down away from the water, and the airflow to evaporate the water from their skin. And that's what's really going to cool them. So it's not keeping the water on all day, which I have seen. That just creates a sauna for the cows. What you need to do is change the frequency. Now, from 24 to around 28 degrees C, I'm talking roughly because this is not including humidity, then you would want to use 1 minute of water on to 14 minutes of water off. As the temperature rises, then you increase that frequency. So if it rises to 28 to 30, 32 degrees C, then you can need to do 1 minute water for 10 minutes off. And when it gets above 32 degrees C, up to the 40s and the 50s, then 1 minute water to 4 minutes off. So you just change the frequency. The other really important thing to consider, especially if you're in hot countries, is to continue the water at night as well as fans. So well into the night, keep that water going. Although it feels cooler to you, the cows will appreciate it, and you will see that money back. We've talked about sprinklers, and we've talked about the frequency of sprinklers and the droplet sizes and where the droplets should be going. Now let's consider priorities. Where do you start? If you've got limited amounts of money, what's the number one place you're going to go? And my advice would be the collection yard, because this is the one place that you're going to have lots of cows in one place, and they're going to be there for 10 to 30 minutes minimum. And this can have devastating effects on their physiology, because even 30 minutes at above that temperature humidity threshold of 65 to 68 is going to have physiological effects for much, much longer. So collection yard is the place to go to start with, and spraying water on the cows. Again, the frequency of water is important, so at lower temperatures 1 minute to 15, then 1 minute to 10, 1 minute to 4, depending on the rising temperatures. And then providing fans in the collection yard too. So water, then fans. Then the milking barn, and you could go to the milking barn and the same things apply. We've talked about barn design, we've talked about sprinklers and where to put them. So for my money, I would weigh up the electricity of the fans and the amount of money you would spend on the water and accessibility of water that you have, and see which one you think is going to be more effective. But for the cows, the water is going to be the one that will cool them down the most. And then what about your dry cows? Now, there has been some fascinating work done on this, and there was a paper in Journal of Dairy Science that was published on cooling dry cows down. Now, there are benefits to this, and you can see up to 5 litres difference in the lactation, 5 litres a day difference for the first 29 weeks of lactation, in fact, for cooling dry cows down. But when you do this, you have to do it for the whole dry period, because what they found was if they cooled cows down for just the far off or just the close-up periods, it was no different to not cooling them at all. But when they cooled them for the entire dry period, then you did see a difference in lactation and yield. So cooling the dry cows down is another great way to go forwards to maximise your lactation potential. Now what about cows that are out at pasture? Now there's less things you can do at pasture, but providing shade is the best. So make sure, if you can, that there are some trees available, or hedges, or some kind of shade available for your cows in hot weather. One tree is not enough, because the cows tend to all go underneath that tree, and there is a risk then for higher mastitis, or dirtier cows and dirtier udders, because they all tend to go under that one space. So they tend to be very, very dirty in those conditions. Again, in pasture, provide plenty of water access, so don't put one trough at one end of the field, make sure there are plenty, and again, no obstructions, 10 centimetres linear access per cow, slightly more because they might have to walk further to get it, and therefore they will take less trips to the water. Now the crucial thing is capturing value back from heat abatement. So you're going to spend money on fans, you might spend money on the water systems, and you might spend money on an automatic system to switch water on and off. It's going to cost you a fair bit of money. But when are you likely to see that back? Of course that depends on where you are and the amount of milk that you might lose in the first place. However, the things to measure to find value are milk yield, not so much milk components, but milk yield certainly. Reproduction is a massive one. So do measure the effects of reproduction a few months after installing heat abatement systems, and you will see the differences it's made. And this is where it's likely to really make you some money. Dry matter intakes will increase. One great farmer I saw in a Middle Eastern country said he didn't realise his cows could eat that much food. And also he didn't realise the cows could give that much milk. And so just providing fans in the right place, frequency of fans, and good airflow over those cows, a little bit of water, and it was amazing how much milk those cows did give. We also talked about the physiological effects of heat stress reducing the capacity of cows' immune systems. And you may see a reduction in things like mastitis and metritis as well. So measure diseases, measure yield, and measure reproduction. And then I'm pretty sure that any investment you make will be made back. So thank you very much for listening, and you've been listening to Inspire Cows, the channel dedicated to dairy health.